Okay. Yeah. Good morning to everyone who's joining in. I'm not sure whether we have had exchanges before. I did teach the Conrad text last time, which I will be doing again this time. But this time, Saswati has been kind enough to give me a couple of texts to teach, which is always great. And doing Beckett is always fun for someone like me who has sort of worked on Beckett for a number of years now. Okay, so we will be talking about Samuel Beckett's The Unnamable in these four classes. Goes without saying, it's insufficient. Four classes are insufficient for a novel which is as difficult as The Unnamable, but it's also, I think, going to be fun. You have to I do apologize for these sounds that will keep cropping up. I'm guessing I'll try and do whatever I can with the admitting business. Anyway, so what I want to do today is more of an introduction to Beckett and the text, whereas we'll be picking up on the text in a sort of faster way from tomorrow. We might be able to begin with the text today. Let's hope so. But I don't know how much progress we'll be able to make with the text because I do want to give you some contextual details. So Samuel Beckett's dates are 1906 to 1989. And the particular novel we are going to read was part of what could only be loosely called a trilogy. There's a lot of debate whether it should be called a trilogy or not. But anyway, we'll come to that a little bit later. So he was born in Foxrock in the vicinities of Dublin, an Irishman who decided to leave Ireland. There were many reasons. Let me not go into all of them, but he kind of followed his master, James Joyce's footsteps to a certain extent. By the way, there's this misconception that Beckett was James Joyce's secretary, which is not true. He was never really his secretary, but he did look up to him almost like a literary father. In fact, as many people assume, and perhaps rightly so, the decision to write in French partially came from this desire not to repeat Joyce, especially after, after the kind of assessments he had made about his own work in English, which started with the novel Murphy when he was around 28, 29, he wrote that novel. And he perhaps thought it was too Joycean a book. Same perhaps with Watt, though there's more Gertrude Stein in Watt than anyone else. But anyway, we might go into these things later. As you know, Beckett is loosely categorized as a modernist, sometimes the last modernist, as the title of one of his later biographies reads. Sometimes he's called the first postmodernist. Again, I mean, let's not go into these debates whether he was the last modernist or the last modernist or the first postmodernist. Anyway, when we think of Beckett, we think of late modernism in the 50s, especially Francophone modernism, modernism in French literature. Though he was an Irish writer, as I said, he would move to Paris. And there were many reasons. One, as I said, was Joyce's own expatriation, not literally, but he again decided to leave Ireland. Same with Beckett. There were many reasons, as I said. Another reason could be censorship. Joyce's books were censored in Ireland, especially in the Catholic circles. It was a bit of a scandal, books like Ulysses. Beckett's first collection of short stories, which was called More Pricks Than Kicks, was banned in Ireland just because of its title. And this kind of infuriated Beckett. There is an early text he wrote called Censorship in the Sarostat, which is a very Swiftian kind of a satire on practices of censorship. So censorship was definitely one reason. Plus, of course, France was a destination for writers at that point. Many writers during political crisis, as you know, also migrated to France. And that constituted what was famously called the left bank back in the day. And this is where most of the expatriate writers would come together and be. Beckett, now some more details about especially the history that he kind of lived through and saw from very close quarters. One important thing to keep in mind was that Beckett was actually a writer from the 30s. He went on to become famous in the 50s especially in 1953, when Waiting for Godot gave him all that fame. But as he said, he was kind of damned to fame. That's the expression again. That's the title of James Nolson's biography of Beckett. This fame was primarily around the theatre works. But as he himself would say, he's more of a novelist who has written plays here and there. But the world seems to consider him to be a playwright who has written, a little bit of novels here and there. So we'll look at his novels and, of course, specifically the Unnamable very soon. But just a few more details before we come to the Unnamable. He was part of the war resistance, the French resistance that happened during the war. So quite literally, he was in the war, someone who had the experience of the war. He was in a secret cell called Gloria. And like Camus, he was part of the French resistance, though they didn't really know each other very well and they didn't work together. He was not a nationalist. This is often a problem that his sort of activism in French resistance is taken to be a kind of nationalist activism. It was not. It was mostly prompted by very personal things that he could see around himself. His Jewish friends were being murdered, and that was one of the things that prompted him to get into French resistance work. But he saw the war from very close quarters. In fact, the second major English novel he wrote, What, was written in this village of Roussillon while he was literally under camouflage, hiding from the Gestapo. The Another interesting detail about his, I suppose, love life would be, and some of you might already know this, it's a bit of a lore. He was stabbed in Paris in the 30s. And after he was stabbed, he was taken to a hospital, of course, where he recovered under the care of a nurse. He eventually went on to live with this nurse and eventually married her. This is Suzanne de Mesnil, the French wife of Samuel Beckett. So it's an interesting kind of almost, a slightly Bollywoodish love story. But it became interesting because Beckett went back to the cell where this petty criminal who had stabbed him was kept, and he asked the criminal why he stabbed him. And of course, he didn't have an answer because he didn't even want to stab him. It was a dark alley. He wanted to take his purse and ended up stabbing him by mistake almost. It was an accident. So the petty criminal didn't have any profound existential reason for stabbing the other person, which perhaps Beckett was sort of, looking at or wanting. Anyway, the French resistance work is kind of important. Many of you would know about his second play. Again, there were plays he wrote before Waiting for Godot. Way back as a student in Dublin, he did an adaptation of Chaplin's Kid, which was the first thing he was part of. The play text hasn't survived. He has also written an early play which was only published after his death, Eleutheria, which is the Greek word for freedom. So Waiting for Godot was not his first play. Anyway, after Waiting for Godot, he wrote the End Game, which is the second well-known play. And Endgame is an important play in the context of what we are talking about because the first draft of the play shows the two characters in a bombarded hospital. And he worked for the Irish Red Cross in this particular bombarded hospital called St. Lo. So he saw these people from very close quarters. Again, that's how the first draft begins. But as you might be knowing with Beckett, he always clips away. He's a minimalist and he always clips away details. If we look at the classic Beckettian compositional process, let's say the first draft would be around 180 pages and the final draft would be 100 pages, perhaps on certain occasions less than that. So he always liked to reduce things. And this is a difference that we see quite markedly, as Beckett himself said, with someone like Joyce, who would often add to his material in subsequent drafting in the sort of genetic process. Now, in the 50s, after the war, this was perhaps his most productive period when he started writing these three novels. It's in the middle of the trilogy that he wrote Waiting for Godot. Okay. The first novel, let me just briefly talk about these two novels before we come to the Unnamable. The first novel is called Molloy, Molloy. It's a very typical Irish name. But that's about it. Other than that, we are not sure about the setting of the novel. Especially the first half seems to be set in somewhere in Ireland because of the landscape that we see, the bogs especially. But we don't know whether it's particularly set in Dublin or in Ireland or in country Ireland. This anonymity of setting is one of the Beckettian characteristics, both in his fiction and in his theatre. We don't know where these plays, where these novels take place for sure. Right? Uh, Now, in Molloy, he sort of uses quite a traditional detective novel format at one level, which is why perhaps of the three novels, it's the easiest. The first part of the book is about Molloy's sort of bizarre journey to find his mother without even knowing whether she's actually alive or not. The novel famously begins with the sentence, I am in my mother's room. It is I who live there now. And a lot has been written on that weird there. You know, if I say I am in my mother's room, it should be I who live here now. Why the deictic shift from here to there that has been substantially commented upon. Anyway, so we have this almost, seductively self-conscious Oedipal reference frame. Molloy on occasions also says he's in search of his mother to be able to kill her. On the other hand, he also kind of knows at the back of his mind that she's already dead. So we have this very peculiar situation. Molloy is, by the way, a homeless, vagrant subject looking for his mother through the forest, meeting weird people in the process, getting into a sort of an affair with a woman. And again, we have the classic sort of existentialist parodies here. Now, just a very quick point, even though Beckett has largely been associated with the theatre of the absurd in Martin Eslin's famous formulation, he never quite liked that label, and rightly so. I mean, no writers would ever like a label. And let's also get this clear that theatre of the absurd, unlike Romanticism, unlike Surrealism, unlike Dadaism, was not a movement. There was no movement, literary movement or theatrical movement called theatre of the absurd. This is a term the theatre critic Martin Esslin coined to actually try and make sense of very diverse, but what he thought was at some essential level the same trend in the then contemporary theatre. Right. So, theatre of the absurd or absurdism, the way Camus would talk about it in the myth of Sisyphus, that's not something that Beckett really bought in a sense. In fact, there are some interesting backhand references to Sisyphus in Molloy. But he always played around with that. This is an argument Theodor Adorno, the famous philosopher, makes on the end game. This is a great essay trying to understand the end game, which all of you should read. In the very beginning of this essay on end game, Adorno makes this point very clearly that what we have in Beckett is not existentialism, but a parody of existentialism. So we have a very clearly parodic kind of moment in Molloy when Molloy encounters this woman who is, walking her dog. And it seems like Molloy ends up killing the dog because he cannot control his bicycle, rams into the dog and kills him. He's, of course, super apologetic about it. But then the woman reveals to him that she was actually about to go to the vet and put out the dog. The dog was in pain. It was not going to live. And, so it was being taken for a kind of death, so to speak, a euthanasia, you call it that, or anything else. So this idea that you kill a person who was about to commit suicide, or you kill a person who is about to be put down, this is a sort of, again, a kind of a mockery of the whole existentialist question. So we see similar, mockeries like that throughout Molloy. Anyway, the first part is primarily Molloy wandering around in the forests, meeting these weird people. He also has encounters with the cops. And there are these sort of, Beckettian moments of kagaz hum nahi dikhayenge, kagaz nahi dikhayenge. It's interesting because there's a moment where the cop wants identity papers from Molloy, and all that Molloy gives the cop is soiled toilet paper. Okay, soiled toilet paper. That's his version of the kagaz. Anyway, these things actually happened in France. Let's remember when Beckett was in occupied France, when the German soldiers were all over France, these kinds of things always happened. He didn't have French citizenship. In fact, he never took a French citizenship all his life. So the identity papers he had were kind of ad hoc, and he would often, not just he, anyone and everyone would often be stopped by the soldiers, and they would ask for these kinds of identity papers. So this is again a very specific reality in relation to the war. Um, so that's what we see primarily in the first half of the book, Molloy searching for, the mother. The second half, the second part of the book, there are two parts in this book. The second part is another kind of quest narrative, another search narrative or quest narrative. And this becomes much more Kafkaesque in the sense that we have this character who seems to be a private detective, Jacques Morin. It opens with Morin's relationship with his son. He seems to be a single parent to this son. And, there's some comic episodes here about a visit to a dentist and all of that. I'm not going to go into this. What essentially happens is that there's this very strange character who comes in, Geber, one fine morning, and appoints Morin to find Molloy. And Morin goes out in search of Molloy with his son. So this is essentially the quest narrative in the second part of the book. And by the time the book comes to an end, we realize that there is a Molloy inside Morin. So it's this kind of a situation where you're looking for someone outside yourself, you end up finding that person inside you. Slowly, let us say Morin degenerates into Molloy. Morin is initially a foil to Molloy. Molloy is this anxiety-ridden, Cartesian man, so to speak. On the other hand, Morin is ultra-confident, on top of everything in life. But then slowly we see that degeneration, where various kinds of Cartesian doubts make the better of him. His relationship with his son also, in a way, declines. Another interesting thing that happens in Molloy, in the book, is a sort of a formal degeneration of Morin into Molloy. What do I mean by that? If you read the first part of the book, you would see there are long, pages without paragraphing. There are increasingly paragraph-less pages. Whereas the second part of the book starts with short, breezy paragraphs. But as the book proceeds, the more Morin turns into Molloy, the more Morin's language at the stylistic level also becomes like Molloy's language, and it becomes unparagraphed. And we end with long, winding sentences and unparagraphed pages, in fact, page after page without paragraphs. There's also a kind of self-cancellation at the end of the narrative, which again has been very widely commented upon by critics, especially postmodern critics. If you've read the book Postmodern Fiction, again, there's a sort of detailed reading of this final moment in that. This is Brian McKell's famous book, Postmodernist Fiction. Anyway, the moment of self-cancellation goes like this. Morin's, and Morin is, by the way, supposed to write a report. This is typical, right? You have to search a person. You have to, of course, try and find him. Whether you find him or not, you'll have to write a report to your authority. Now, this report is what we are supposedly reading in the second part of the book. Now, the second part of the book had started with a sentence like, it's midnight, it's raining. And the book comes to an end with sentences like, and I'm quoting from memory here, I'm not quoting verbatim, he went back into the room and started writing. It's midnight, rain is beating on the roof or something like that. It was not midnight, it was not raining. So that's the kind of self cancellation you get at the end of Molloy, where the narrative declares itself to be a lie. The narrative declares itself to be a fiction in the sense of unreal. Okay? Fictionality of fiction is unraveled in this final moment. So that's Molloy, very briefly. Malone Dies is the second novel in the trilogy. Malone Dies, again, Malone is a very common Irish name. There's some amount of perhaps overstanding in the critical claim that Malone could be a shortened form of man alone, which would make it like a very nice kind of a Malroyan title. Again, an existentialist title, Man Alone Dies. Malone, if it is a short form for man alone. I'm not too sure about that. Malone is a fairly common Irish name, as most of you would know. Now, this is a sickbed narrative in the classic modernist vein. If we think of, Solzhenitsyn, if we think of Thomas Mann, there's a certain presence of sickbed narrative in modernism. It's a sickbed narrative. From the very beginning, we know Malone is dying in his hospital bed, and he's completely rooted to the bed. He's bedridden, as they say. He is trying to tell himself stories. He makes a plan to tell himself three stories: a story about a human being, a story about an animal, and a story about a thing. Quite, detailed in that sort of mapping of the human and the non-human. So this is the plan in Malone Dies. Now, again, I'll not go into the stories, but this idea of storytelling and failure of storytelling is something that I'll come back to when we read The Unnamable. The failure of storytelling, because that's in a way the experimental edge of this entire trilogy, and especially The Unnamable. So, Malone Dies is about these sickbed acts of storytelling, where you want to tell yourself a story because you are bedridden. You want to tell yourself a story where you're not bedridden. You want to tell yourself a story where you're moving all around the place. The first story, it's an elaborate story that Malone tells himself, is the story of this character called Saposcat. That's a very funny name, of course. And it's a little boy. And there's a very weird kind of story that launches itself but doesn't quite take off. We will see examples like this in The Unnamable too, where a story is started or initiated, but it becomes like a false end, as it were. It's like a false start. It doesn't take off. It doesn't go anywhere. The narrative doesn't go anywhere. The Saposcat story is one such story. It's almost a mathematical genius that we have this little boy who is always doing, mental arithmetic, as the novel says. And there's some funny episodes with his encounter with the neighborhood, and his encounter with the family in the neighborhood, especially. Again, encounters with animals' death, that perhaps the death of the animals that perhaps instills a certain sense of death in him too. But as I say, the story never quite takes off, and it's abandoned after a point. Suddenly, the name is changed. We'll talk a little bit about names in The Unnamable too. Suddenly, the names are changed, and the character is called Macman. We go into, so the stories never come to an end. They mutate into another story. One story mutates into another story. So suddenly we are in the Macman story. Saposcat is renamed Macman. And the second story is primarily about, an asylum, and Macman's sort of weird love story with this female attendant in an asylum, which again goes back to many of the sort of Swiftian moments I was initially alluding to. Anyway, what happens, and I'll quickly come to The Unnamable now because I'm aware of time. What happens at the end of Malone Dies is that we never get to see the moment of Malone's death. So Malone doesn't quite die outside of these stories. What happens in a very particularly Beckettian way, I would say, is that Malone dies inside one of his stories. He dies inside one of his stories. In fact, the death of the character is marked by quite a brilliant last sentence in Malone Dies, which is almost a falling sentence. And I mean that literally. Sentences are usually organized horizontally, right? So they are horizontally organized. That's how we write them on the page. We have an unfinished sentence that is organized vertically at the end of Malone Dies. And this vertical sentence is like a dying sentence. And this is a sentence inside the Macman story. So we never quite come back to the sickbed. Again, this is a point that, you know, in postmodern fiction, this term is quite often used. It's called metalepsis. Metalepsis refers to a technique where you make the layers between multiple narratives unstable. If you make the line of division among multiple narratives unstable, what becomes then is that you have a story within a story within a story within a story. It's like Chinese box fictions, but the difference between the usual Chinese box and these kinds of metaleptic fictions is that the partitions are not stable. The partition that separates one story from another is not stable. So again, Malone doesn't quite come back to the sickbed, but dies within one of his own stories. What does that mean? As if the death of the human being is the death of the story, the storytelling function, if you think of it, you know. In cognitivist literary studies, there's a lot that has been said about storytelling as adaptation. Someone like Boyd has written on this, storytelling as adaptation. I'm thinking of the book that is called On the Origin of Stories. So he talks about storytelling as a form of adaptation. I mean, the question is, why do human beings tell stories, right? Other animals, other non-human creatures may not always have the narrative function that human beings have. Anyway, we're going into a different direction here. Let me come back. But this is how Malone Dies ends, with the supposed death of Malone marked by this vertical sentence within one of his own stories. So that leads us to this moment of thinking where we wonder, where is the unnamable then? Why is this character the unnamable? We're not even sure about the gender of the character, even though it seems to be masculine. From various references, we gather that. But why is this character unnamable? Why is this character someone who cannot be named? He's barely human anyway, as the novel, you know, continuously sort of suggests. He's barely human, not even properly human. We'll talk more about this question of the human. But coming back to the unnamable, the assumption is this is a sort of Beckettian version of Dante's hell. And we are looking at a voice from beyond the grave, a dead voice, a voice that speaks without a body that is alive, a voice that speaks from the dark in this unknown place, which is like an inferno or a sort of infernal place. Before we start talking about the novel a little bit more, let me take you through some of the details in terms of its genetic history, especially some of the interesting details about composition. So Beckett wrote this novel around 1949-50, after, of course, the other two novels were finished. It was the French version, L'Unnamable, was published in 1953. The English translation happened much later and was published in 1958. So you can see there's a 5-year gap there. In terms of composition, he wrote it around 49-50, the French one, wrote it in 1 year, whereas the English translation took nearly 2 years. He sort of didn't do it for a while, procrastinated, did other things, wrote Waiting for Godot, wrote Endgame, wrote All That Fall, his first radio play, was writing another play called Embers. In the middle of that, he went back to the translation of L'Unnamable and finally finished it from around 56 to 58. That was the time when he wrote the English text. By the way, Beckett is an interesting figure in the context of translation studies because he's one of those rare global writers who has basically written everything in two languages, almost everything in two languages. Most of the times he would write a text in French first and then translate it into English. That's what he did with the trilogy. Sometimes he would start with English and then translate it into French. It's rare, but there are some texts like that, like Company, for example. Uh, there are very rare texts which are written in English and never translated into French, like the last one, Westward Ho. The second trilogy is, I mean, usually these three short prose pieces are considered the second trilogy. The first trilogy is what we are discussing, of course. The second trilogy is Company, Il Seen, Il Said, a title that was also used by Jean-Luc Godard for one of his films, Malvu Maldit. And then finally, Westward Ho, with that sort of complex pun on Westward Ho. Anyway, so Westward Ho is a text he never quite translated into French, and he said he couldn't. Someone else did, of course, after Beckett's death. Edith Fournier translated it back into French. Anyway, so he's a bilingual writer in every sense of the term and a self-translator. And these texts are, as you can clearly understand with any self-translation, not verbatim translations. They're recreated. And what is very interesting in terms of the genetic history is that how the plays that Beckett wrote between 53 and 58, or let's say after 50, when the French version was completed, and 56, these 6 years, and the next 2 years when he would be finishing work on the English translation. So we're talking about 8 long years. And he was active in the theater, writing other texts in the theater, primarily for the theater. So how texts that were written in these 8 years cast a shadow on the English version of the Unnamable is something very interesting in the genetic history of the text. With the original French text, it's also curious. Beckett would always write on notebooks. He would write using notebooks, write inside the notebook. And the first version ends where the notebook ends, to the point that many genetic critics have often wondered whether he was just trying to finish a notebook more than anything else. Was it as unserious as that? One wonders. Anyway, we might come back to that point. There are also very interesting cases of the translation re-injecting the original. Like there's people who have never read the novel know the final sentence of the Unnamable. It has been quoted almost by everyone, from post-colonialists to feminists to of course, modernists and postmodernists. You must go on. I can't go on. I'll go on. This is how the novel ends. Now, in this tripartite structure, in the original French text, which was published in 1953, there was no I can't go on. It was just, you must go on, I'll go on, right? In fact, there was no you must go on. It was like, I must go on, I will go on, right? That I can't go on was imported from the English translation. He wrote it like this in the English translation. And in 1971, when another new edition of L'Unnamable was due, Beckett said, let's have that. I mean, he wrote that back into the typescript, that the French text should also be, I can't remember right now, but it should be something like Il faut continuer, je ne peux pas continuer, je vais continuer. I think it was something like that. So, je ne peux pas continuer, I can't go on, was added to the English text, to the French text later from the English translation. So there are some interesting sort of genetic details like this, some of which we might come back to. Let's try and do, some sort of a conceptual contextualization for the Unnamable before we slowly start talking about the text a little bit today. Now, Beckett, this trilogy was kind of crucial for him as a writer because this gave him a lot of critical success, to put it like that. Some of the most significant philosophers and critics in France reviewed the Unnamable, reviewed the trilogy, They wrote about Beckett, which was already something, like George Bataille did, Maurice Blashaw did. It had a great reception, especially in the intellectual circles of France. And that did something for Beckett, there's no doubt about that. That's how someone as famous as Roger Blanc would decide to do Waiting for Godot straight away. And the premiere was directed by Roger Blanc. And Roger Blanc was a big name, a really big name in French theater at that time. Anyway, so just in terms of the conceptual background, let me just, there's a lot to be said. We can't say everything, of course, and that's very Beckettian as well. He was extremely influenced by this one particular philosophical work. It's a 3-volume critique of language. Towards a critique of language would be the title in English, by this German philosopher Fritz Mathner, Mauthnner, Mauthnner. Fritz Mathner wrote this 3-volume critique of language, which really influenced Beckett. The influence again came from Joyce in a way. Joyce, it was for Joyce that Beckett was doing some reference work for Finnegan's Wake, to be more precise. And that's when he encountered Fritz Mathner. And Fritz Mathner's critique of language influenced him in the sense that Mathner was talking about this this is a work that came out in 1901, much before the post-structuralists started talking about critique of language. This is not a post-structuralist critique of language, but something that we always see in Beckett is this mistrust of language, the inability to trust language, the impossibility to trust language. Language is a shoddy tool of communication. It's the only thing we have. That's the unfortunate situation, but it's a shoddy tool of communication. And this is not just Beckett, as you know, as students of modernism, I suppose you would know in literature that modernist literature quite generally often shows the incapacity of language to represent reality. Language fails to represent reality. And this is why storytelling also fails, because storytelling happens in that shoddy medium of language. So Mathner's critique of language did play a role when it came to Beckett's own writing. Much earlier, if we go back in time a little bit, in 1936-37, in a famous letter to a friend, again a German friend, Ahel Kaun, Beckett wrote that he wanted to abuse language as much as possible. In another letter, he called this logoclasm, right? Logoclastic, like iconoclastic. So logoclasm is a disposition to attack language. It's quite similar to what the great Kamal Kumar Majumdar said, লেখকের কাজ হলো ভাষাকে আক্রমণ করা, Kamal Kumar Majumdar said, which is exactly the same point. Of course, not necessarily coming from Beckett, coming from his own perception. So this idea that a writer has to attack the language of communication is something very modernist, of course, not just specific to Beckett. In fact, Beckett was talking in that letter about Gertrude Stein, the famous, modernist of the time in France, who was perhaps the only modernist to write nonsense novels. In fact, in a course that I just finished teaching in IIT on modernism, we read Gertrude Stein's Lucy Church for nearly 3 weeks, and it was quite an interesting challenge to even teach Lucy Church, I'm sure for the students as well, to sort of talk about Lucy Church, because it's literally a nonsense novel that runs for 240 pages. Without trope, without anything. Anyway, so Gertrude Stein was also a reference point for Beckett in the letter to Manning, where he mentioned the term logoclasm. He mentioned Gertrude Stein as well. So this idea of rupturing language, the expression that he uses is to drill holes in language. He wants to drill holes in language. Language is most effectively used when it is most effectively abused. This is what he says in that letter to Ahel Kaun. We can think of this exercise when we read The Unnamable, this attempt to rupture language, right? Let's come to the novel a little bit now and start talking about it. I am aware that we don't have more than 10 minutes. I would like to have at least 2 or 3 minutes for questions if you have any at the end of this class. So let me just quickly go to the text. Now, I have shared a particular edition of the text with Shashwati, which I'm sure she would be sharing with all of you. So that's the text I'll be using, which is the 2012 Faber edition, because it's a corrected edition. There were many mistakes in some of the earlier texts, and this was very well edited by the scholars who did it. Anyway, so I've shared that text and I'll be using that text. So the page numbers that I mentioned will be from that text, and I'll mention the PDF page number. This is an EPUB converted text, so it doesn't have the original page numbers, unfortunately. But you can follow the PDF page number. It should not be a problem. Okay, so on page 31, this is the first page actually of the book. There's a lot of introduction. There's a lot of genetic material or things like that before this point. But this is how the novel begins on page 31 of the PDF that I will share, that you will soon have access to. Where now? Who now? When now? Unquestioning. I say I, unbelieving. Questions, hypothesis, call them that. Keep going, going on, call that going, call that on. So just to give you a flavor of the prose, this is how the novel begins, with a question mark on all the three things that are typically associated with a realistic book of fiction. Where, space or setting, who, subject, when, time. And from the very beginning, the narrator says, I say I without believing that I am I. This is again a sort of a foregrounding or a foreshadowing, if you want to call it, of the sort of famous post-structuralist idea that the self is always divided by language. As someone like Barthes, Rolla Barthes would say, I speak I in the process of saying language. In speech itself speaks us. It's not just that I speak and that's me as the producer of language. I'm also a product of language. So the subject, the human subject, is not just a producer of language. The human subject is also a product of language. Why? Because the I that is produced by me in a sentence is a word. It's a word that is produced by me. So there is a linguistic entity there. And the I is a linguistic entity. Now, so from the very beginning, there is this self-doubt. Another philosopher who looms large, there are various philosophical contexts that we will slowly go into from tomorrow. But another philosopher who looms large over the unnamable is Descartes, and Descartes' famous method of doubt. The term method is used recurrently throughout the novel, as you will see once you read it. And this, of course, could be a reference to Discourse on Method, Descartes' famous text, where he talks about this method of doubt, which finally gets resolved when he comes to that famous axiom, I think, therefore I am. Descartes calls it an Archimedean point of certainty. This is an Archimedean point of certainty, that I think, therefore I am. Everything else could be, cast under doubt, but this is something that cannot be doubted. It's the bare minimum of certainty, right? I think, therefore I am. There is a sort of doubt over this I think, therefore I am in this novel as well. Just to lay out the cards a little bit that we will go into in a deeper way from tomorrow, the novel is about thought as torture, a kind of tortuous thinking. Thought itself, to use that, again, that Cartesian expression, theater of thinking, as Descartes would call it, the theater of thinking is a theater of cruelty, with due respect to Artaud. This is not really the Artauian cruelty. This is quite literally a theater of cruelty. So the theater of thinking is a theater of cruelty. To think is to torture yourself. That's one sort of important implication that comes out of it. We will see that this novel can be read, of course, as philosophical allegories of Cartesian method, Hegelianism in a very strong way, because the master-slave dialectic comes in. We will discuss it next time. But just as we can read this novel as philosophical allegory, we could also read it as a historical allegory. Because at some level, this voice from beyond the grave that speaks and that gets tortured, as it were, as it speaks, is like any human being in a death camp in the war. And Beckett, as I said, there's a historical reason where we could bring in this, allegory or this allegorization. We'll see some references in the work that speak to this strand. One could read this text as a historical allegory of a voice in a concentration camp, in a death camp, and that kind of torture. It's also a novel that could be read as a satire on pedagogy, a satire on the very idea of teaching, because, and that's an irony that, of course, we cannot help undermark. This novel is, in a way, about the failure of storytelling, as I said, but also the failure of a narrative education model, some sort of a narrative education model, which is like, the classic studia humanitatis, the classic humanist education. So as we would see, the stories never belong to the unnamable, the subject. They belong to the other. The masters, who are also tyrants in a way, who are tyrannical, these tyrannical masters like Basil or Mahoud, these are the names that are used in the book, they torture the unnamable by not allowing him to tell his own story. They keep imposing their own stories on the unnamable. And that's the dialectic of the book. In a way, the unnamable, and that's the element of torture as well, the unnamable is asked to reveal himself. He does not believe in this I, and yet he is asked to reveal himself, to express himself. But then again, the irony is the same masters who want to extort some sort of a self-expression from him, they are also imposing their own stories on the unnamable, trying to make him believe that these are his stories, whereas he's not entirely sure whether these are actually his stories or are they imposed on him. What he wants, what the unnamable wants, is to reach some sort of a silence, a pure silence beyond stories, beyond language. He's on trial by language, as it were. And I'm echoing Giorgio Agamben's famous reading of Kafka's The Trial, where Agamben says, if you remember that first sentence in The Trial, where it is said that someone started this rumor about Joseph K. And that's what eventually leads to his arrest, his trial, and everything. And throughout the novel, as you well know, we don't know what he is accused of. It's a little bit similar to the second part of The Outsider by Camus, or The Stranger by Camus, whichever title you want to use. The interesting detail here is that Agamben says that the rumor is a function of language. Nobody started a rumor against Joseph K. Language itself conspired against Joseph K. We could say the same about the unnamable, that there's a linguistic conspiracy going on. Language is the torturer, the master, the tortuous master. And the slave here, the unnamable himself, is put on trial by language. So it's a trial by language. Language itself has put the subject on trial. The language is a foreign entity. It's an alien entity. It's not something that is assimilated by the subject. And these narratives, the stories, are again, agents of this, foreign language or this alien language, which doesn't quite sit well with the subject. So as I said, the desire is for the silence beyond language, but it cannot be reached, it seems. It remains utopian. Okay. Let's just stop here for today. And let me see if you have any questions at this stage. Please feel free. Yes, Hiranmay, please go ahead. Okay, you are writing it. You could also unmute and speak, but that's not a problem. Let me see if I can. Uh, yeah. Is the text a dismantling of the Cartesian first principle, cogito ergo sum, by means of separating the thinking I and the being I? To a certain extent, yes. I mean, that's the famous Lacanian reading, right, of the two subjects, the thinking I and the existing I. They are not the same, as Lacan would say in a psychoanalytic way of thinking about the divided subject. That the therefore is a break or a cut. I think, therefore I am. This therefore is a cut, the signifying cut of language that divides the subject. Yes, so that would be a Lacanian kind of interpretation, let's say, but without going as far as that. There is no doubt that the subject is fragmented in Beckett, irrespective of Lacan. I mean, Beckett was not that familiar with Lacan, from whatever little we know, and especially at this time in the 40s and 50s, he wasn't very clearly. He was very well acquainted with Freud, by the way. He had his own psychotherapy done by Bion, the famous analyst, who was at that point a trainee analyst, which is why I'm saying psychotherapy and not psychoanalysis, because it's difficult to say what he practiced with Beckett. This was in Tavistock after Beckett lost his father as a young man. He started having certain panic attacks and started having certain symptoms like he could not move. I would have talked about these things in more detail, but let me just quickly mention them. He would not be able to move physically. Sometimes he would just feel like flopping down in the middle of the street, and he would not be able to move. He would be having these panic attacks in his sleep and things like that, not be able to sleep properly. So with these symptoms, he went to Bion at the advice of one of his friends who was a psychiatrist. Bion was a trainee analyst in Tavistock Clinic in London. And they did an analysis, or let's call it psychotherapy, but a psychoanalytic psychotherapy for sure, because Bion was being trained at that point as an analyst. That happened for almost 2 years. So Beckett was very, very much acquainted with psychoanalysis and Freudian psychoanalysis. How much did he know Lacan? We don't know. Especially at this stage, very little. That one can say. Later on, maybe a little bit more. But anyway, without getting into that idea of historical influence, you're right that there is a split between existence and thinking in the novel as well. But it's a larger fragmentation in the Unnamable, which is not just a fragmentation of the I of thinking and the I of being. The One could say that both are cancelled out. There is no being and there is no thinking either, because the thinking is imposed from above. From above, I say, because it's imposed by this hierarchical other. I don't think, the other makes me think. It's almost like the subject here is a ventriloquist's dummy. The subject is a dummy at the hand of the ventriloquist who can do anything, the ventriloquist wants with the subject. Okay. I mean, we will talk a little bit more about this, which would answer your question. Any other quick question? Feel free to unmute yourself and speak. You don't have to write. I mean, if you feel like writing, that's fine with me, but it'll be good to hear some voices.
Hi, sir.
Hi, Dea, is that?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
please go ahead. Yeah.
I probably missed this part, but anyway. So you said that the plays that Beckett wrote in those 8 long years, they impacted the Unnamable.
Hmm.
How exactly did they impact? I
That's a
missed.
good point. Yeah, so I didn't actually, you're right. I didn't say anything
Oh,
more on
right, right, okay.
because I would have said perhaps a little bit later, but very briefly, we will go a little bit more into this. Towards the end of the Unnamable, we might come to this only in the last class, but there is a theatrical metaphor which is quite clearly coming from a play like Waiting for Godot, because he's talking about the audience waiting for a play to start and the play never quite starting, and then the audience realizing that that's the play, the waiting is the play. There's also again a sort of influence of the stagecraft of Endgame. If you remember, Endgame has this sort of shelter-like setting, which is again anonymous, and there are two huge windows on two sides of this shelter. One window that looks out into the sea, The other window looks out into Earth, what is called Earth. So there's a similar setting towards the end of the Unnamable that is mentioned, which clearly seems to come from, Endgame. Yeah. So that's a short answer to your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Anything
you.
else? Maybe one final question. I'm aware of time and you might be having other classes. So, logistically speaking, I have a curiosity. It's not about the Unnameable. Where are you joining from? Are you guys still at home? Because I'm assuming some of the classes have started offline, right? So, are you
So
guys joining from
our
the university?
our
Yeah.
batch is at home. Our batch is at home. We are not allowed into campus yet to go to class.
Okay. Okay. So
It's a
you are
PG.
doing all classes online at the point.
Yes,
At
sir.
this point.
Yes, sir.
Okay, okay, good to know. Because I was wondering whether it was this weird situation that some of you are actually in the university, lodging somewhere and using your phone or whatever, your laptop to do the classes, which would be mildly bizarre. But anyway, I mean, this whole situation is bizarre. It's not your fault. Okay. Anything else? Maybe we could call it a day. And I think it was Aratrika who was mentioning this possibility. Actually, if it remains like this, perhaps we could manage it. But yeah, do let me know if there is a, because one of the things, let me clarify this point. One of the things I discussed with Shashwati was this problem that has happened in the past, that, whoever comes into the link the first, the video strangely goes to that person. I've faced this earlier on when I was using Google Meet for one of the IIT classes or one of the IIT courses. But I'm not sure whether Google Meet has worked on this and resolved it. But I'm guessing if the link comes from you, and if you set, not as in you personally, but if it comes from any one of you who sets it up through Google Calendar, I'm guessing the video recorded will go to you. Like unlike this one, which is going to come to me, I guess. Right.
Actually,
So yeah, go
as
ahead.
students, we don't have university ID, so none of us can record, but most of us have
Okay.
separate recording software. So even
Right.
if we do host the one of us hosts the meeting, we've got there's a group of us who make sure that we've got backup recordings irrespective of whether a professor is recording or not.
Okay, okay, sure. That will be great. So if the traffic remains what it was today, we can manage it. So, just let me know. If it is too much of trouble, you could anyway do a backup recording. That's up to you, of course. I wouldn't get into that. But if it's too much trouble, we could possibly continue like this, because most of you did join more or less by 11:05, and there were just two or three, I had to admit, later on. That is doable. When it becomes a flurry, that becomes a problem. So yeah, do let me know in case it's feasible. Otherwise, we'll continue with this link, right? But if there's another link, please make sure that it's circulated, and please make sure that I have it. Okay?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So I'll see you
Thank you, sir.
tomorrow at 11 then. Okay, bye-bye. Bye. Let me just stop the recording first though.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you and see you tomorrow.
Thank you, sir.